Being a cop in a small town in Minnesota isn't what most people would call an exciting life. There are no car chases, no high-profile investigations, no headlines. Just long stretches of quiet roads, the hum of the cruiser, and a town that seems to sleep through its own existence. But after enough years of it, that quiet starts to feel like safety. You get used to it. You even start to crave it. There are about 10,000 people in the town I live in. It sits miles away from anything resembling civilization. A cluster of streets surrounded by farmland and silence. Nothing much happens here, and when it does, it's the kind of thing that barely makes the weekly paper. A drunk and a fist fight at the bar, kids smashing mailboxes for fun, a stolen bicycle, the occasional domestic dispute. Nothing serious. Nothing that sticks with you, except once. There's one case that still follows me. One that never made sense no matter how many times I went over it in my head. It's been years, and I still can't explain what happened. And I think about it more than I should. It was early spring in 2014. The air still carried that sharp cold left over from winter. And the rain had been falling for days. Not heavy, just a slow, endless drizzle that turned the earth to mud. Jerry and I were on patrol, taking our usual route around the outskirts. Then the radio came alive with a crackle in Karen's voice. Our dispatcher. A possible break-in on Turner Road. The Garrity residence. Even before she finished, I already knew who it was. We all did. Eileen Garrity had become a sort of unofficial part of our routine. A widow, living alone in a rundown farmhouse nearly a mile from her nearest neighbor. She'd call us at least once every few weeks. Sometimes it was noises in the attic. Sometimes lights in the cornfield. Once, she was convinced someone had broken into her basement, but it turned out to be a raccoon. She was harmless, just lonely, lost in her own head since her husband had died 3 years before. We never gave her a hard time about it. We'd check the house, walk around the property, make sure everything was fine. She'd thank us, calm down, and we'd leave. By now, those visits were almost part of the job's rhythm. One of the few breaks in the monotony of patrolling a place where nothing ever happens. So when the call came in that day, I wasn't concerned. I remember Jerry giving me that look, half grin, half sigh, like we both already knew what we'd find. Probably another false alarm. The drive out to her place was quiet, the rain tapping softly on the windshield. When we turned onto Turner Road, the fields stretched out around us, gray and endless, under the overcast sky. The Garrity house appeared through the mist. Old, sinking slightly at one side, its porch sagging like it was tired of standing. And she was there, waiting for us. The sight of her made my stomach tighten. She'd always been thin, but now she looked fragile, almost transparent. Her skin hung loose on her bones, her cheeks hollow, her eyes ringed in deep shadows. Her hair was tangled, unwashed, and her clothes looked like she'd been sleeping in them for days. But it wasn't just her appearance, there was something about her expression that froze me. A look I'd only ever seen in photographs of soldiers, that distant, vacant stare of someone who's seen too much and can't find their way back. We approached her slowly. She didn't speak. She just looked at us with those empty eyes that seemed to see through everything. We told her to wait outside while we checked the house. She didn't argue. Inside, the air was cold and heavy. There was a smell, stale, metallic, and faintly sweet, like old water left standing too long. The house used to be spotless. She'd always kept it tidy, almost obsessively so. But now, dishes were stacked in the sink, food containers left open on the counter. Clothes and papers were scattered across the floor. as if she'd stopped caring entirely. In the living room, the couch was covered in blankets and pillows. There was a Bible open on the coffee table beside a rosary, a half-eaten sandwich, and a few cups of cold coffee. It was clear she'd been sleeping down here, too afraid to go upstairs. We did a full sweep room to room. No broken locks, no open windows, no footprints except ours. But what stood out weren't the things we found. It was the things that felt wrong. Every mirror in the house had been smashed. Glass littered the floor in glittering shards, reflecting nothing but the dull gray of the afternoon light. And every closet door had been nailed shut, boards hammered across them hastily, unevenly, as if whoever did it was in a panic. In the hallway, one of those doors had a jagged hole blasted clean through the middle. Wood splinters still clung to the edges. Leaning nearby was a double-barreled shotgun, its chambers empty, both shells spent. The air still carried that faint, burnt smell of gunpowder. We checked upstairs, then downstairs again. Nothing. No sign of an intruder. No signs of forced entry. When we turned to leave, she was standing behind us. I hadn't heard her come in. Neither had Jerry. She just stood there, pale and motionless, staring at the hole in the closet door. It wasn't confusion or fear on her face. It was something worse, a kind of hopeless acceptance, like someone who already knew what was coming. She stood there like a statue, staring at that broken door as if the darkness behind it was alive. When I think back on it now, it wasn't what she said that unsettled me most. It was the way her body seemed hollowed out, as if something had already taken everything that made her human and left only a trembling shell behind. We sat her down in the living room, away from the shattered glass, away from the smell of gunpowder. She looked exhausted, her skin pale under the yellow light. She wasn't hysterical. She wasn't even afraid in the way most people are when they're in danger. It was a deeper kind of fear, the kind that settles in after you've realized there's no one left to save you. She began to tell us what had been happening. It started, she said, with a sound. At first, she'd thought it was a mouse or a squirrel trapped behind the wall of her bedroom closet. A faint scratching, soft and rhythmic, always starting at the same time every night. But the sound wasn't coming from the floorboards or the corners. It was higher, halfway up the door, steady and patient, like fingertips dragging lightly across the wood. She tried to ignore it, but it kept coming back, night after night, always in the same place. When she finally gathered the courage to open the door, the scratching stopped. There was nothing inside, just her old dresses, her husband's coats, and the smell of mothballs and dust. She started locking the door every night after that. But the scratching didn't stop. It grew louder. It became desperate. Sometimes she could feel it, a faint vibration through the wood, as if something inside was testing the barrier between them. Then one morning, she opened the closet and saw deep gouges on the inside of the door. The marks were too high for any small animal. They looked like they'd been made by hands. From that point on, she began sleeping on the couch downstairs. The scratching followed her for a while, but the house would always go silent by dawn. She told herself she was imagining things, that it was loneliness or the wind or age, but loneliness doesn't call your name in the middle of the night. She woke up one evening to a voice coming from the closet, a voice she knew, her husband's. The tone, the rhythm, even the way he used to breathe between words. She said it was gentle at first, coaxing her, telling her everything would be all right, that it was time to come with him. For a moment, she wanted to believe it, the kind of belief that comes from grief, not faith. The need to hear the voice of someone you loved, even if it comes from behind a locked door. but something about it was wrong. She couldn't explain how she knew. The voice sounded too careful, too precise, like someone mimicking his words, but missing whatever part of him made them human. The fear hit her so suddenly, she couldn't move. She said the air in the room felt thick, electric, as if the space itself was holding its breath. Then the voice changed. It stopped pretending. The sweetness drained out of it. It began to scream, deep, violent, inhuman. The sound was so loud it shook the walls. She could hear something pounding from the other side of the door, harder and harder, until she thought the wood would split. That was the last night she ever slept upstairs. She spent the following weeks on the couch, clutching her Bible like it could hold the house together. During the day, she'd feel foolish, but every night the terror came back. And then one evening, the pounding began again. Not from one closet, but from all of them. She said it was like the entire house had come alive. Every door, every wall, the sound of fists and nails hammering from inside the walls, the same rhythm in every room, as though dozens of things were trapped there together, screaming in unison. She nailed the closet doors shut after that, every one of them. For a while, that seemed to help, until she looked in the mirror. She told us it happened in the bathroom one morning. She was washing her hands when she looked up and saw that her reflection wasn't looking back. Instead, standing where her reflection should have been was something else. Something wrapped in a dark, tattered cloak. Its face wasn't flesh, just a skull, yellowed and cracked, with two red lights burning where eyes should be. She said it grinned at her. The smile stretched wider and wider until it split the face in half. Then its hands, or what passed for them, reached forward. They were long, clawed things that pushed through the surface of the mirror like the glass was water. She threw a bottle at it. The mirror shattered. After that, she broke every mirror in the house, every single one. It didn't matter anymore if she sounded crazy. She wasn't taking any chances. By then, the house was barely livable. No light, no reflection, only boarded doors and the stale air of a place where someone had stopped living long ago. She said the pounding stopped during the days, but 3 days ago it had started again. In broad daylight this time. It didn't matter if the curtains were open or if the sun was shining through the windows. The scratching, the knocking, the whispers never ceased. And then it escalated. The voices started to mock her prayers, repeating the words she said but twisting them, changing them into curses. The air turned cold even in the middle of the afternoon. The wood began to creak as though something heavy was pressing against it from the other side. That morning she'd finally broken. She took her husband's shotgun, loaded both shells, and fired into the closet. The echo had filled the whole house. Then came the silence. For a few seconds, she'd believed it was over. Then, through the hole she'd blown in the door, 2 red eyes glowed back at her. They blinked once, and something deep inside the darkness laughed. It spoke a single word to her before fading away.
Tonight.
When she finished, the room went silent again. I remember the way my heart was beating. Slow, heavy, the kind of rhythm that feels too loud in your ears. We didn't believe her, of course, but there was something about the way she told it that made it impossible to dismiss entirely. There was no hysteria, no embellishment, just exhaustion. We made a decision then. She couldn't stay in that house another night. If what she said was delusion, she needed care. If it wasn't, then at least she wouldn't be alone. We drove her to a small roadside motel just outside of town. The air smelled of rain and wet asphalt. She sat in the back seat, silent, her head leaning against the window. When we checked her in, she looked a little lighter, like the simple act of leaving that house had lifted something off her chest. She thanked us before we left. There was even a faint smile. It was the kind of smile people wear when they think the worst is finally behind them. We went back to the station in silence. Neither of us said what we were thinking, but I knew we were both wondering the same thing. What if she wasn't crazy? We told the chief everything. He listened quietly, sighed, and agreed she'd need to be moved to a care facility soon. We planned to contact her children the next morning, but that call never happened. At 4 a.m, the phone rang again. The chief's voice was tight, and I could hear the unease behind it before he even said the words. There had been an incident at the motel. When I arrived, the parking lot was surrounded by flashing lights and yellow tape. Rain still fell in a thin mist, and the smell of wet concrete mixed with something else. Something coppery. Mrs. Garrity's room was sealed off. The chief stood outside, pale, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He told me she was gone. I thought he meant dead, but he shook his head. Not dead. Gone. The neighbors had heard screams around 2 a.m. Violent sounds. Banging, thrashing, a struggle. Then silence. When officers forced their way in, the door and windows had all been locked from the inside. The bed was soaked in blood. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling were speckled with it. The sheets had been torn apart, dragged halfway across the room as if someone had tried to hold on while being pulled away. 10 thin trails of blood stretched across the carpet, finger marks clawing toward the door. They stopped at the closet. The door stood open. The space inside was empty. There wasn't a single drop of blood past the threshold. No sign of a struggle beyond it. No trace of her anywhere. She had simply vanished. They never found her body. And to this day, I can still see those 10 lines on the motel carpet when I close my eyes. 10 desperate marks, carved by hands that were trying not to be taken. Years passed before anything strange happened again. In a town like ours, time doesn't move so much as it drifts. One day blends into the next until you start to forget how long you've been wearing the same uniform, driving the same roads, watching the same rainfall on the same houses. The Garrity case became something the department didn't talk about out loud. It turned into a ghost story. The kind rookies whispered about on night shifts, half joking, half afraid. But I never told my version. There was no point. Nobody would believe it anyway. After a few years, even I started to convince myself I'd imagined parts of it. Maybe the blood in that motel room hadn't been as much as I remembered. Maybe the marks on the carpet hadn't really looked like finger trails. Maybe the old woman had found a way to disappear on her own. That illusion of calm lasted until the summer of 2019. It was late June or early July, one of those evenings when the air feels too still, like the world is waiting for something. I was on night patrol, filling in for one of the younger officers who'd had surgery. The station was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums. The chief was at his desk, flipping through paperwork, and Pete, one of the veterans, was talking idly about fishing. That's when a girl appeared. I use that word carefully, appeared, because none of us saw her walk in. One second the room was empty. The next, she was standing there in front of the desk. She looked like she'd been pulled from a storm. Her clothes clung to her, like she'd just climbed out of a lake. Water dripped from her hair onto the floor, and her skin was so pale it seemed to absorb the light instead of reflect it. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, like someone trying to wake up from a dream they didn't want to be in. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then she began to speak, her voice trembling, low, the kind of tone that carries more exhaustion than fear. She said she'd escaped from someone who had tried to kill her, that she'd been taken, hit, locked in a car trunk, and somehow survived. The chief told her to sit down, trying to stay calm. I remember watching her closely, trying to make sense of the way she moved. Too slow, too deliberate. Like every motion was a conscious effort. She gave her name, 19 years old, born and raised right here in town. At first, nothing about that seemed impossible until she mentioned the place her parents owned. A hardware store on Main Street, a business that hadn't existed for decades. The name she gave triggered something faint in my memory. It took a moment to find it, a name from old newspaper clippings I'd read years ago. There had been a McDougal Hardware once. It had burned down in the late 60s, taking the owners with it. Their daughter had disappeared before that, sometime in the 1950s. The woman sitting in front of us said her name was Shirley Ann McDougal. She spoke like someone recounting a nightmare. Walking home after a movie, stopping at a drugstore that hadn't existed since before I was born, meeting a man who needed help retrieving his wallet from under his car seat. She said he'd hit her from behind, that she'd woken up in the trunk of a car, felt it fill with water after a crash, and somehow escaped into the night. Her story was so detailed that it stopped feeling like a lie. It sounded too precise, too vivid, too old. Every part of it was wrong. The theater she mentioned had closed 30 years earlier. The street she described hadn't looked that way in half a century. She spoke of a town that didn't exist anymore, as if she'd walked straight out of its memory. I remember the chief trying to stay professional, writing things down, pretending not to notice the way our hands were trembling. We asked her what year she thought it was. She didn't hesitate. 1956. When we told her the truth, she went still. Not the kind of stillness that comes from shock, but something colder. Like the air had been sucked out of her lungs. She looked around the office in silence, her eyes moving from the calendar to the computers to the fluorescent lights. Her face changed slowly. Confusion, disbelief, horror, until she just stopped reacting altogether. Her skin, already pale, seemed to turn the color of paper. Then she asked to use the restroom. One of the officers walked her down the hall. He stayed by the door, waiting. A few minutes passed. Then he called out. No response. When he opened the door, the room was empty. The stalls, the sink, the window, empty. No sound, no tray, nothing but a faint trail of wet footprints that stopped beneath the open window. The drop outside was 10 feet to the ground. The grass below was dry. No footprints, no signs of anyone landing there. It was like she'd stepped out of existence the same way she'd entered it. We filed a report. The chief contacted the state police. They put out a bulletin, but no one matching her description was ever found. For a while, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe she'd been under the influence. Maybe she was unstable, suffering from a breakdown. Maybe we'd been tired and our memories didn't line up. But there was something that kept gnawing at me. The name, the story, the drowning, the car. I started digging through old archives in my spare time. The McDougals had indeed existed. Their daughter, Shirley Ann, had vanished in August of 1956. She'd gone missing after leaving the theater one night, last seen walking alone near a drugstore. The case had gone cold. I read the article again and again, memorizing every word. It matched what the girl in the station had told us down to the smallest detail. except she had told it as if it had just happened. And then, 1 week later, the news broke. A man testing new sonar equipment on a nearby lake had found something at the bottom, an old car buried in the silt, its body rusted but mostly intact. The police dragged it to the surface. It was a 1953 Buick, Oklahoma plates. Inside was the skeleton of a man, a drifter who had been suspected, back in the 50s, of kidnapping and killing women across several states. The case file had labeled him a spree killer. He'd vanished without a trace. When they pried open the trunk, they found a second skeleton, a young woman's. The name came up in the report, Shirley Ann McDougal. I remember staring at the article for a long time, reading the words over and over. The coffee went cold in my hand. There was no mistake. The remains had been positively identified through dental records. It was her. But I had seen her, spoken to her, 63 years after she died. When the story of the lake hit the news, something in me went cold. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't even fear. It was the same feeling I'd had the night we found that motel room. That quiet, heavy certainty that something in the world was wrong in a way no one could ever fix. The state police handled the investigation. There were press releases, interviews, words like closure and justice thrown around, but there was no closure. At least, not for me. I kept thinking about the woman who'd appeared in our station, the way she'd looked, drenched, shivering, dazed, as if she'd just climbed out of the very water where they'd found that car, the way she'd vanished, the way the story she told matched the past exactly, as if she'd been trapped in it, reliving it, refusing to accept she was already dead. And I thought about Eileen Garrity, 7 years before, the old woman who'd begged us not to leave her alone, who'd said the thing in her house was coming for her that night, who'd fired into the dark and seen red eyes staring back through the hole in her closet door. I thought about the blood on the motel walls, the 10 streaks across the carpet, the way the trail had stopped at the closet, as if the rest of her had been pulled into somewhere we couldn't reach. For years I told myself the two cases weren't connected. Different people, different times, different worlds. But that's the thing about denial. It only works if you never look too closely. Both of them had heard voices. Both had described something that came from behind a door. Both had been taken when no one was watching. And both were gone before anyone could help them. I started rereading every report, every note, every old file we still had in the archives. I told myself it was routine, just tying up old ends. But I think deep down, I was searching for some kind of pattern. Something human I could cling to. But there wasn't any logic. No link to follow. Just echoes. The Garrity house burned down 2 years after her disappearance. Electrical fault, they said. By the time firefighters arrived, it was already gone. Nothing left but the foundation and a few warped nails sticking out of the ground. When I drove out there to look at it, the place was nothing but a black scar in the middle of the field. The air still smelled faintly of smoke, even weeks later. I remember standing where her living room used to be, thinking about the way she'd described the scratching inside her walls. I wondered if that house had ever really belonged to her, or if it had belonged to something else all along. I never told anyone about what happened with the McDougal girl. The official report said she escaped, suffered a breakdown, disappeared again before the psych unit could evaluate her. The chief kept it that way. He retired soon after. So did Pete. The file sat in the cabinet for a while, and then one day, it wasn't there anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the way she looked at us before asking to use the restroom. There was something in her expression, kind of peace, maybe even relief. Like she'd finally remembered where she was supposed to be. Maybe she'd only come back to finish what had been left undone. Maybe she'd been looking for someone to hear her story before she went back into the dark. Or maybe whatever had taken Eileen Garrity, whatever had lived in that house and whispered through the walls, had found someone new to speak through. I don't know. And I've stopped trying to know. There's a quiet in small towns that feels comforting until you learn what kind of things can hide inside it. How thin the line is between this world and whatever's waiting on the other side. Sometimes it scratches, sometimes it calls your name. Yet most nights I sleep fine, but every now and then when the wind moves just right against the windows, I hear a faint sound in the walls. It's soft at first, rhythmic, almost polite. A sound like fingertips brushing the wood from the inside. I tell myself it's the house settling. I always tell myself that. And then I lay still, counting the seconds between each scrape, waiting for it to stop. It never does right away. It just pauses, like something listening back. And when it finally stops, the silence feels like it's waiting for me to answer.
Subscribe and walk deeper in the dark.